The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when the human, Captain John Turner, found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. A routine exploration mission had turned into a nightmare. His shuttle, damaged by an unexpected asteroid storm, had crash-landed on a strange, unfamiliar planet. Alone, disoriented, and wounded, John tried to assess his situation, but before he could figure out a plan, they appeared, alien soldiers, their figures tall and imposing, emerging from the mist. John barely had time to react. Within moments, he was surrounded, bound, and forcefully taken aboard a massive alien ship. His captors were silent, their eyes cold and calculating. There was no room for questions or explanations. They marched him through the labyrinth of the alien vessel, and with every step, John's hope dwindled. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way to escape, but all he could do was walk. When they finally reached the center of the ship, he was thrown into a small, cold cell, its walls metallic and unwelcoming. His hands were still tied, and his body ached from the rough handling. It seemed like an eternity before the door finally opened, and a figure entered. She was unlike anything John had ever seen. A regal presence, her eyes glowing with authority, her skin a shade of violet that shimmered in the light. The alien princess stood before him, her tall frame emanating power. She didn't speak immediately, but studied him carefully, her gaze sharp and focused, as if she was measuring every inch of him. John remained quiet, his back pressed against the cold wall, his mind alert despite the pain. He had no idea who she was, but one thing was clear. She was the one in charge. "You are a human," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "How did you manage to land on my planet?" John swallowed hard. His throat was dry, and his mind struggled to form words. His voice, when it came, was rough. "It wasn't intentional. My ship got damaged in the asteroid storm. I had no choice but to land here." The princess tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "A human, stranded. It's unusual." John braced himself for what might come next, but instead of the expected punishment, the princess turned to one of her guards and gave a soft command in a language John didn't understand. The guard nodded and left, leaving the two of them alone. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. The alien princess seemed to be lost in thought, her gaze flickering from him to the ground and back again. There was something about her, something not quite right. She didn't seem entirely sure of herself in this moment. John didn't know what to make of it. The tension between them was thick, and he wondered if she was just toying with him. After all, he was her prisoner. It was her right to do whatever she pleased. But there was a hint of something else in her expression. A curiosity, maybe, or even uncertainty. John couldn't quite place it, but he knew it would be important. With a sharp movement, the princess turned back to him. "You will remain here," she said, her voice final, "until I decide your fate." As she left the room, John watched her retreating figure. His mind was filled with questions, and one thing was certain. This wasn't going to be an ordinary captivity. The princess had taken him prisoner, but something about her had changed. Maybe it was just the beginning of something bigger than he could understand. The hours passed slowly for Captain John Turner. His body was tired, his mind restless. He tried to sleep, but the uncomfortable cold of the cell kept him awake. The walls seemed to press in on him, and the silence was deafening. He had no idea where he was or how far from Earth he had been taken. The only thing that kept him going was the idea of escape, but for now, that seemed impossible. The guards were everywhere, their eyes constantly watching him. Meanwhile, the alien princess, Elira, walked through the halls of her ship with a heavy heart. Her mind was a whirl of thoughts. The human prisoner had been taken with such ease, yet something about him bothered her. She had encountered countless species, many far stronger and more dangerous than humans. But this human, he was different. When she first saw him, she had expected him to show fear. Humans were weak, fragile creatures, easily broken by the harsh realities of space. But John Turner had shown none of that. Instead, he had been calm, almost detached, and his eyes, they weren't full of fear, but rather something she couldn't quite name. Curiosity, defiance. Elira couldn't stop thinking about it. She had ordered him thrown in the cell because it was the logical thing to do. Humans were unpredictable, and she had no reason to trust him. Yet, she couldn't ignore the strange feeling growing inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced before. It troubled her deeply, making her feel exposed, vulnerable. Elira had always been confident in her power. As the princess of the planet Solorith, she was used to control. Her word was law, and no one dared to challenge her. But when it came to this human, she felt something was wrong. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't like the many prisoners she had dealt with over the years. The more she thought about it, the more she felt the odd, unsettling sense that this human might be more than just a captive. She stopped in front of her chambers, taking a deep breath. She had a duty to her people, to her planet, to her family. She couldn't afford to be distracted by such emotions. Yet, despite her best efforts to shake it off, the feeling lingered. Her mind drifted back to the human. He had shown no fear, and that intrigued her. It was almost as if he was capable of looking at her, a powerful alien princess, as though she were just another person. Enough, she whispered to herself, pushing the thoughts aside. She had a role to play, and she would not let a single human prisoner distract her from her duties. But as she walked away from her chambers, a part of her could not deny that she was shaken. Her authority, her sense of control, felt uncertain for the first time in her life. Elira hated this feeling. She had been trained to be strong, to rule with wisdom and power, but the human had made her question everything. And so, with a heavy heart, she returned to the observation room, staring at the security feed that displayed the human prisoner. She needed answers. Why had this human affected her this way? She had no idea that her struggle had only just begun. Princess Elira stood before the viewing screen in the command room, her eyes fixed on the image of the human prisoner. His face, calm and collected, stared back at her from the small cell. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't begging for his life like others had done when they were captured. He simply sat there, his gaze steady, his posture strong. Elira had seen prisoners break before, some crying, some fighting, but never like this. The feeling she had dismissed earlier now grew stronger, refusing to be ignored. It wasn't fear that she felt. No, it was something far more unsettling. A sense of confusion, a deep stirring that she could not explain. This human, this fragile being, was not like any other species she had encountered. His calmness, his resilience, were unlike anything she had seen in her life. It both irritated and fascinated her. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the control panel. Elira had been taught that strength meant power, and power meant control. She had been trained to see the universe as a place where only the strong survived, where the powerful ruled, and the weak obeyed. It was the way of her people, and it had never failed her. Until now. Why does this human affect me this way? Elira muttered under her breath, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned from the screen, pacing across the room, her mind racing. She couldn't remember the last time she had been so unsettled by something so insignificant. A prisoner, a human. It was laughable. Yet the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her mind kept returning to him. His calm, his silence, his strange ability to remain unfazed in the face of danger. It had all started to challenge her beliefs. The princess stopped in front of a large window that overlooked the ship's vast expanse of space. The stars glittered like diamonds, distant and cold, just like her. But now, in the dark void of the universe, she felt small. For the first time in her life, Elira felt out of control. It made her angry, frustrated even. She was the princess of Zalorith, the future ruler of an empire that spanned the galaxy. Yet this human, this prisoner, had somehow shaken her confidence. She clenched her fists, turning away from the window. "This is ridiculous," she said. trying to push the feelings aside. She was stronger than this. She had to be. But as she made her way back to her private quarters, the truth gnawed at her. She could no longer deny it. The human had made her question her own power, and that realization frightened her more than anything else. She knew that she could not simply let him go. His presence on her ship, in her life, had become a challenge that she could not ignore. Elira took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She would deal with this. She would find a way to regain control. But as she closed the door to her chambers, she knew one thing for certain. The human was not just another prisoner. And that thought alone left her shaking, though she would never admit it aloud. The next morning, Elira stood in front of the prison cell, her eyes fixed on the human. Captain John Turner sat against the cold metal wall, his expression unreadable. There was something about him that stirred her, something that made her feel both irritated and curious. The princess had made her decision. It was time for a direct confrontation. With a wave of her hand, the guards opened the cell door, and Elira stepped inside. The guards stood at attention, their eyes trained on the human, but Elira waved them off, signaling that she could handle this herself. She moved toward John, her steps purposeful and measured. The human raised his head slowly, meeting her gaze. There was no fear in his eyes, only quiet determination. "Human," Elira began, her voice steady but cold. "You've been in my custody for some time now, and yet you don't beg for mercy. You don't plead for your life like the others. Why is that?" She studied him closely, looking for any hint of weakness. John didn't flinch. His voice was calm, and his words were measured, just as they had been before. "I'm not afraid of you," he said simply. "I've been in worse situations. You don't scare me." The princess blinked in surprise. That was not the answer she had expected. "You think I'm incapable of scaring you?" she asked, her tone colder now. "No," John replied, his gaze unwavering. "I just don't see the point in fear. Fear won't change anything." Elira felt a strange knot in her stomach. The human's words weren't what she expected to hear from someone trapped in her ship. She was used to hearing desperation or resistance, but this was different. John's confidence wasn't arrogance, it was something else. The princess narrowed her eyes. "You speak as if you understand everything, as if you know what you're dealing with." She moved closer to him, looking down at him from her superior height. "But you don't. You're a prisoner, my prisoner. You have no power here." John tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words carefully. "Maybe you're right," he said after a pause. "But the truth is, no matter how powerful you are, I still have one thing you don't." Elira's curiosity was piqued. "And what might that be?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Freedom," he answered simply. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy and meaningful. Elira looked at him, trying to understand what he meant. There was something in his eyes that made her pause. Freedom. How could a prisoner, bound by her will, have freedom? She was the one in control. She was the one who ruled the galaxy. And yet, the human's words made her question it. John continued, "You may have control of my body, but not my mind, not my will. I choose to not be afraid. I choose to think. You can keep me here, but you can't take that away from me." His voice was soft but firm. Elira stood silent for a long time, staring at him. Something inside her stirred again, something she couldn't easily dismiss. The princess hated it. She hated how much his calmness bothered her, how much it made her question herself. Finally, she turned and walked toward the door. Before she left, she glanced back one last time. "We'll see, human," she said quietly. "We'll see just how much power your freedom really has." And with that, she left the cell, leaving the human to his thoughts, and herself to her own unsettling ones. Princess Elira sat alone in her private chambers, staring out at the stars beyond the ship's windows. The endless black void of space seemed to stretch forever. And yet, she felt trapped. She clenched her hands into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to suppress the strange unease that had taken root in her chest. For the first time in her life, Elira felt vulnerable. It was a sensation she was not accustomed to. Vulnerability was weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. She had always been in control, always had the power. Yet, the human prisoner, Captain John Turner, had managed to break through the walls she had carefully built around herself. His calm defiance, his refusal to bow to her power, had unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. She stood up abruptly, walking across the room to her personal desk. She picked up a small object, an ancient artifact passed down through her family for generations. It was a symbol of her royal lineage, a reminder of her duty to her people. She had always found strength in it, but now, for some reason, it felt heavy. Her fingers traced the edges of the artifact, and she let out a soft sigh. "I should not be feeling this way," she muttered to herself. "He is nothing more than a prisoner." But even as she said the words, she knew they were a lie. There was something about him that made her question everything she had ever believed. The princess had been raised to be a ruler, to command respect and control. She had never considered that anyone might look at her differently, that anyone might challenge her authority without fear. But the human John had done just that. He had spoken to her with such calmness and strength that it had made her feel exposed. Elira sank down into her chair, her mind racing. Why was it so difficult to shake off the thoughts of him? Why was it so hard to ignore the way he had looked at her, as if she were no different from any other being? She had seen many different species throughout her life, each more powerful or more advanced in their own way. But humans, they were different. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the uncertainty that had been growing inside her. It wasn't just John's words that had affected her. It was the way he had looked at her, the way he had made her feel like maybe, just maybe, there was something more to life than power and control. Elira shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. "This is foolish," she whispered. "I am the princess. I am the one in control." But the words felt empty as soon as they left her mouth. The truth was, she didn't feel in control anymore. She felt lost, unsure of what to do with the emotions swirling inside her. She had never felt this way before, vulnerable, confused, and uncertain. With a frustrated sigh, Elira stood and walked over to the window, staring out at the stars once more. She knew she had to do something about this. She couldn't allow herself to be weakened by a prisoner, especially one as insignificant as a human. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that John had awakened something in her, something she had kept buried for too long. Her heart raced as she realized the truth. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure of anything. And that thought scared her more than any enemy could. Captain John Turner had spent what felt like days in his cold, sterile cell. Each moment dragged by slowly, but he had grown accustomed to the silence and isolation. It gave him time to think, time to plan. His mind was constantly working, running through every possible way to escape, to regain his freedom. It had been a long shot from the start. Getting captured by an alien princess was not something any human was prepared for. But John wasn't like most people. He didn't give up easily, especially when the stakes were this high. He was a soldier, trained to think on his feet and never give in, no matter the odds. As Elira's presence seemed to haunt his thoughts, John couldn't help but wonder about her, about the strange connection he felt with her. It wasn't just that she was his captor. It was the way she'd looked at him. He had seen the hesitation in her eyes, the momentary confusion when he spoke about freedom. Something about her had shifted in those brief encounters. He had been watching, observing, and he had noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor. She wasn't like the other aliens he had encountered. There was something more to her, something human, despite her advanced technology and power. It was this realization that kept him awake at night, kept him wondering how to use it to his advantage. But right now, the priority was escape. Everything else had to wait. John's eyes scanned the walls of his cell. He had already tested the strength of the door, the bars, and the locks. He knew how they worked, how long it took the guards to respond to his movements, and most importantly, he knew how to make them underestimate him. It was time to put his plan into action. He had seen the guards changing shifts regularly, and the pattern was clear. They were not as vigilant as they should have been. They assumed he was just another prisoner who would comply, who would wait to be led to his fate. But John wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. He had a plan, and it involved a lot more than just escaping this tiny cell. When the guards came by for their usual inspection, John pretended to be asleep, his body still and relaxed. He held his breath, his heart racing. He had to time this perfectly. One misstep could ruin everything. As they walked past the cell, he made a slight movement, just enough to catch their attention. The guards didn't seem to notice the subtle shift. They moved on, unaware that John was awake and alert. His chance had come. He reached under his cot, pulling out a small object he had managed to conceal during his brief moments of freedom. It was a tool, simple but effective. John had spent enough time watching the guards to learn how to use it. Quietly, he worked at the lock on the door. The minutes felt like hours, but finally, the lock clicked open. He breathed a sigh of relief, then quickly and quietly stepped out of the cell. His heart raced as he moved through the dark, narrow hallways of the alien ship. Every sound, every footstep, every creak of the metal underfoot made him freeze in place, but he didn't dare slow down. This was his one shot at freedom. John knew the princess was still on the ship, somewhere in the depths of its core. He didn't know if she would notice his absence right away, but he couldn't worry about that now. His mind was focused on one thing: getting off this ship and back to Earth. But as he moved through the shadows, John couldn't shake the feeling that Elira was closer than he thought. Something told him she would be watching, that she would be prepared. This was far from over, and the real challenge had just begun. Elira stood before the large view screen in her private chambers, her fingers brushing lightly against the cool glass as she watched the vast emptiness of space. The stars twinkled in the distance, but they did little to ease the tension that had settled inside her. She had tried to ignore it for days now. The nagging feeling that something had changed. Everything had shifted ever since the human, John Turner, had been brought aboard. She had tried to remain in control, to treat him as just another prisoner to be dealt with. But the more she observed him, the more confused she became. There was something about him that broke through the walls she had built around herself, something that made her question everything she had believed in. Her mind wandered back to their last conversation. The human's calmness, his refusal to show fear or desperation, had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. He had spoken of freedom, of how it couldn't be taken away from him, no matter the circumstances. His words echoed in her mind, making her question her own beliefs. Was she truly as powerful as she thought? Was she really in control? Elira's fists clenched. She was the princess of Zalorith. She had been taught that power was everything, that control was the only way to survive in a universe filled with chaos. But the human had made her feel something she hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. The feeling was foreign, uncomfortable. Elira had never allowed herself to feel weak. It was unacceptable. She turned away from the window, unable to look at the stars any longer. She needed to focus. She had a mission. But there was that feeling again, that sense of something more, something she couldn't explain. The princess paced back and forth in her chambers, her thoughts swirling in confusion. She had spent years building her reputation as a ruler who commanded respect, someone who struck fear into the hearts of those who crossed her. But the human, he hadn't feared her. In fact, he had shown her something else entirely: strength. And it wasn't the kind of strength she was used to seeing. It wasn't the physical power of an army or the dominance of her royal bloodline. It was something deeper. It was the strength of will, the ability to stand tall in the face of fear and uncertainty. Elira paused in the middle of the room, her breath catching in her throat. She realized, with sudden clarity, that she wasn't just struggling with her feelings about John. She was struggling with herself. The human had made her question everything she thought she knew. He had made her question her own sense of power, her own purpose. A voice in the back of her mind whispered, "You can't let him change you." But Elira knew that wasn't true. There was no going back now. She had already changed. She had already felt something for him. Something that scared her more than any enemy ever could. It wasn't just about control anymore. It was about understanding. About finding a way to bridge the gap between two worlds. Her heart raced as she realized that, in some strange way, the human had become her mirror. He had shown her a side of herself she had never allowed to surface. A side that was vulnerable, that was uncertain. And in that moment, Elira understood. She had to make a choice. She could continue down the path of dominance and control, or she could face the truth and learn to embrace the unknown. But no matter what path she chose, she knew one thing for sure. Things would never be the same again, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. The corridors of the alien ship were eerily silent as Captain John Turner moved through them, his heart pounding in his chest. He had escaped his cell, and now he was free, at least for the moment. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every footstep echoed louder than the last. But John kept moving, his mind focused on one thing: getting out. He had been planning this escape for days, carefully observing the ship's guards, learning the layout, and waiting for the perfect moment. Now that he was out, there was no turning back. He had to reach the hangar bay where the shuttle was stored. Once there, he could get back to Earth. But as he turned another corner, he froze. Standing before him, blocking his path, was none other than Princess Elira. She was standing tall and unyielding, her eyes piercing through the dim light of the hallway. There was no hint of hesitation in her posture, no sign of weakness. She was the same powerful figure he had seen since the moment he'd been captured. But something in her eyes was different now, a glimmer of something he hadn't expected. John swallowed hard, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of the small weapon he had taken from the guards earlier. He didn't know what Elira intended, but he couldn't afford to be caught off guard. "Going somewhere." Elira's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. She had been expecting this. John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, trying to gauge her next move. He had been expecting to face her as an enemy, as a force to be reckoned with. But there was something in the way she looked at him now that made him pause. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice steady. "You won't stop me." Elira's gaze hardened, but she didn't move. "I could," she said softly, her eyes flickering with something that might have been doubt. "But I won't." John's brows furrowed. He had expected her to act with hostility, to command the guards to subdue him. But instead, she was simply standing there, watching him. "Why?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. "Why aren't you stopping me?" The princess hesitated. Her usual confidence wavered for the briefest moment, and in that split second, John saw something in her eyes, a vulnerability he hadn't noticed before. "I don't know," Elira replied, her voice quieter now. "I should stop you. I should take you back to your cell and finish this, but I can't." John didn't know what to say. The situation had shifted completely. Elira wasn't just his captor anymore. She was something else. He could feel the change in the air, the tension between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. John's hand slowly left the weapon at his side. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he sensed that Elira wasn't going to stop him. Not now. Not in this moment. "You're not the person I thought you were," John said softly. Elira looked at him, her gaze filled with a mix of surprise and something else, something like relief. "I'm not the person I thought I was either." John took a step forward, and Elira didn't move to block him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. Elira had given him the chance to leave, but something in her eyes told him she was waiting for something. Maybe she was waiting for him to make the choice that would define what came next. He walked past her, feeling the weight of her gaze on his back. As he moved forward, he knew the path ahead would be uncertain. There was no telling what would happen next. But for the first time, he felt like he wasn't running away from something. He was walking toward a new beginning. And he wasn't sure if Elira was running from something too. But she would have to choose, just like he had. John Turner didn't stop walking. His boots echoed through the empty halls of the alien ship as he moved toward the hangar bay. His heart was still pounding, but now there was something else there too, a sense of confusion mixed with relief. He had expected to be stopped, to be dragged back to his cell. But Elira had let him go. She hadn't even tried to stop him. The princess, once his captor, had given him a chance, and John wasn't sure what that meant. Was it weakness? Was it an act of mercy? Or was it something else? He had never expected to feel this unsure about anything. As he turned another corner, he reached the heavy metal doors that led to the hangar. His shuttle was just beyond them. It was still his ticket back to Earth, his escape from everything that had happened. It was the only thing that had kept him focused, the only thing that had kept him going. But as he stepped forward, he hesitated. For a brief moment, the thought of leaving crossed his mind. He could just walk away, board the shuttle, and return to his life on Earth. But then his mind drifted back to Elira. He remembered the way she had looked at him, the way she had let him go without a fight. Something had changed between them, and he wasn't sure if it was something he could ignore. John stopped in front of the door, his hand resting on the control panel. He could open it, step inside, and be free. But the truth was, he wasn't sure if he could leave now. The princess had made a decision. She had allowed him to go, but why? What was it about their strange interactions that made her question her own role, her own beliefs? He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to clear his mind. His instincts told him to leave. His training as a soldier told him to escape and never look back. But something inside him told him to turn around. Elira was still on the ship. She was still somewhere out there, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The doors to the hangar slid open, and he stepped inside. His shuttle was waiting, but as he glanced back at the door, a voice called out from behind him. "Wait." John froze. He knew that voice. It was Elira's. She stepped into the hangar, her tall figure illuminated by the soft glow of the lights above. She moved toward him, her eyes fixed on his with a mixture of determination and something else, something vulnerable. "You didn't leave," she said, her voice soft but strong. "I don't know if I can," John replied honestly. His heart was still racing, but he was no longer sure of what he wanted. The decision wasn't as clear as it had been before. There was something about Elira, something about this situation that made it harder to walk away. Elira stopped just a few feet away from him, her expression unreadable. "I've been wrong," she said quietly, "about humans, about strength, about power. And now I don't know what to do with what I'm feeling." John took a step closer, his gaze softening. "I don't know what you're feeling either. But maybe that's not something we need to figure out just yet." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, full of questions neither of them had answers to. Finally, Elira spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "You've given me a choice, and I'm making it." John's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what her words meant, but he knew one thing. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And for the first time, he wasn't so sure if leaving was the right decision.